All right, welcome back to the HTML5 Essential Training Series. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the span element. We just wrapped up with a pretty good discussion on the div element. We looked at some sections. Now we're going to talk about the span element because there's some things that we can do with this inline element that aren't available. We can't do with any of the elements inside of HTML. So let's have a brief discussion on this because, again, as we're moving forward, we're slowly building that knowledge of how to develop our web pages, our HTML web pages. So the span element in HTML5 is an inline element that allows the developer to format individual groups of text in our HTML5 pages. This inline element has been traditionally used to identify content so that CSS can be used to format that particular content. As we move through this demonstration, I'm going to demonstrate the span element and the ability to assign a class to that element, allowing text to be formatted consistently across your website. As we demonstrated in previous tutorials, using the div element, adding the span element to the HTML5 document flow has no effect on the appearance of the page. In other words, just as the div element was, we had no actual effect on the document flow. We saw nothing in the browser window to indicate that we actually had a div element installed or in place inside my HTML file. The span element is the same thing, same way. It works the same way. It does not impede document flow, and it does not change the appearance of the way things appear in the browser window until we start formatting that element using CSS. But using its class or ID attributes allows us to format that text using CSS formatting, and I'm going to demonstrate that as we get into the demonstration. For modern websites, span elements should only be used when more specific tags do not apply. In other words, in HTML5, we now have some inline element tags that allow us to become specific and focus on formatting particular element types based on these new tags. So when it's possible, let's use the new HTML5 elements instead of the span elements that we've been using in the past. Let's look at some of the elements that are available that can be used in place of some of the span elements that we've used in the past as we've been developing our sites. So a list of the new semantic elements available in HTML5 that can replace certain span elements. So in block elements, we have the pre tag, the block quote tag, and the address tag. And let's keep in mind, I may have made it sound like these were only available in HTML5, but they're not. They've been available for a while. We want to make certain that we use, when applicable, we use these block element tags instead of span tags. The same thing with the inline element tags. We have abbreviation tags. We have a citation tag or a citation tag. We have a tag for code, a definition tag, an emphasis tag, a keyboard tag, a quotations tag, a sample tag, a strong tag, and a variable tag. So again, when it's possible, we should be using these tag elements in our HTML5 documents instead of using the span element. For each span element that has added to the HTML structure, a class attribute will be given or will be added to give that span element a unique class so that we can address it in CSS. We can also give it an ID class, but normally we don't. In span elements, we're normally using classes and not IDs. These class attributes will be used as selectors in CSS to apply formatting to the contents of the span element. And it's very similar to what you saw that we had done in the div tags earlier in the previous tutorial. We're actually going to assign a class to the span element, just as you see here at the bottom of the screen. We're going to give that class a name, and that's going to allow us to target the text that's in between those span tags for particular formatting. And that's what we'll be doing in these demonstrations. So an important note before we move into the demonstrations, unlike the ID attribute that we discussed in previous tutorials, the class attribute can be used multiple times on a single HTML document. We're actually setting a class for that attribute. So it's not unusual, and in fact is often the case, that a class will appear multiple times in the content of the text. And again, I will be demonstrating that as we go through this demonstration. So let's move into our development environment and let's demonstrate some of the things that we've just talked about. All right, so let's go ahead and move into our development environment so that we can actually demonstrate some of the things that we just talked about in the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation. As we always do before we start any of our tutorials, please confirm that your Apache Web Server is up and running because you will need that environment in order to test the things that we're getting ready to do. Let me go ahead and minimize that screen. Let's bring up our text editor. I'm going to be using Sublime Text 2, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up my browser window. I actually have the chapter 11 underscore 01.html file up and loaded. If you have a copy of the exercise files, you can actually have that loaded also. If not, now would be a good time for you to pause the video and start typing in the generic HTML doc that I've got up on our screen. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit so you can get the entire doc. There you go. Now would be another good time to pause. I've added quite a few extra sentences to this document so that we can actually demonstrate using the span element. You'll notice this is the same document that we actually ended our previous tutorial on divs with. I actually have my section IDs in here now. I've got the formatting set up based on my CSS main_1 file. And I formatted this document. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's loaded in our browser window. And now we're just going to demonstrate how we use the span element to format individual sections of text using span. I mean, we've learned, based on what we've been doing so far up to this point, you've learned how to format blocks of text, div areas and section areas and headers and footers. Now let's look at how we format individual pieces of text. So the first thing I want to demonstrate is how I'll actually format the word coins. So since our little sample site is on a coin website, it's about coins, let's go into our CSS file and let's add a class. I'm going to go down here right under section 2 and put a dot, and I'm going to put red text. That's going to be the name of my class. I'm going to open and close my curly braces, and you notice I have the dot in front of it. If you remember, in a previous tutorial we talked about making IDs always begin with a pound sign or a number sign before we name it in the CSS file. Well, for classes, we do the same thing with classes, only this time we use a dot instead of a pound symbol. So I've got a dot red text, and that's going to symbolize in my CSS file that we have a class that we're getting ready to define. And I'm going to go ahead and say color, semicolon. I'm just going to go ahead and give that class a color of red, and I'm going to use my hexadecimal format for my color coding. So I'm just going to say 900, and that with a semicolon. Don't forget to start that color designation with the pound symbol, or else it's not going to be considered a color. Let's give it a font size of 1.1em. And that's it for now. Let's go ahead and save that change. And again, good time for you to pause if you need to type that into your CSS file. If you refresh your browser window, there should be no differences in the browser window, because even though we've designated that class, we haven't assigned it to anything yet. So let's go back to our chapter 11 underscore 01.html file. Let's do a save as. I'm going to save that as chapter 11 underscore 02. All right, now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and inside my text, I want to designate where I'm going to actually put some of these span tags. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and where it says pre-symbol word coins, where that word coins, let's give it a span tag. So I'm going to type less than sign, span, then I'm going to say class equal, and remembering how we designated that, red text. So I have that opening and closing, don't forget capitalization because it is case sensitive. Opening and closing quotation marks. I'm going to close out my span tag with that greater than sign, and then right at the other side of the coins word, I'm going to close out the span tag. So I have my less than / span greater than, and I'm going to save that change. And I'm going to confirm that the class that I designated my CSS is red text. I want to make sure we're calling the right one, and it is there. It is right there, red text. So when I save all these changes, which I'm going to do right now, and by the way, now would be a good time for you to pause if you need to type that into your document. When I refresh my browser window, the word coins right here should become red and assume the properties that we gave it inside of our CSS file. So let's go ahead and do a save all. Let's refresh our browser window. Remember, we got to load the new file. We saved a new file because we're no longer on that 01. We're actually on the 02 file. And you'll notice now that we've got that red coins displayed in our screen. So we've actually used a span tag now to identify just a particular piece of text that we want that way. And we can use this over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and copy that from my window. Control C to copy. I'm going to run down here to the second heading where I've got coins of the late 1800s. I'm going to put my cursor right before the word coins. Control V to paste that in there, and then I'm going to close that tag just like I did the last time, a less than sign, / span greater than sign, because with that opening tag I want to have that closing tag, that pair match, remember? And now we're doing the same thing. We're giving this word coins the same formatting that we've given the other word coins in the heading. So let's go ahead and do a save all. Now would be a good time to copy that, to pause your video if you need to type that text in. When I go ahead and refresh my browser window, you'll notice now my second coin has assumed the same properties and the same formatting as the first coins that we had in the first heading. So that's one of the advantages of using span formatting. I can actually now designate individual words. I can format those words for them to stand out, or hyperlinks, or whatever I needed to do. All right, so we demonstrated how we can do individual words inside of our HTML documents. Let's go ahead and let me show you a couple other things that we do as web developers do using this span element. I'm actually going to set up a class called italic, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a font style of italic. And now what I want to do is inside my paragraphs, let's go ahead and save all those changes. There's many times in the course of developing a web page where I'll have groups of text that I want to appear italic because I want them to stand out or be emphasized in the browser window. Now keep in mind, if I wanted this to be read by a screen reader, I'd actually use the emphasize tags, or I'd use the italic inside of HTML. If I'm just doing something now that I want to appear in my browser window because I want it to stand out differently than the rest of the text, I'd actually use a class for span. But again, if you want this to stand out for a screen reader, you'd actually use the HTML tags to do this. So I say span, class equal, put in my quotes, opening and closing quote. I'm going to close that span tag. Then I'm going to go down to the end of this line and close out the span tag itself. And again, this would be a good time for you to pause the video if you need to type that in. One of the reasons I like using a good text editor, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed it through the tutorials, but if I click on the opening tag, it'll actually underline, at least Sublime Text 2 does. Some of them actually highlight it. But Sublime Text 2 actually underlines the closing tag to let you know that it's there. Like if I were to click on this P tag, you'll notice I get a small underline under the closing P tag that closes that particular tag out. May not seem very important as we're doing these small pages. As you get more and more into complex web pages, these small little features of a text editor become very important as you start getting into complex pages. All right, so let's go ahead and save those changes. If I should refresh my browser now, you'll notice now that we've got a group that's highlighted as italic, and because this is a class, I can reuse this over and over again on this page to highlight other areas of my text. I can do all kinds of things with it, and actually what would have been a much better class, because italic, you really should be using the HTML element when you're doing italic. So let's actually use the word highlight. Go back into our CSS file, and let's do it like so, where we can actually say background, and I'm actually going to give this a highlight. I'm actually going to give it a colored highlight. As in yellow, I'm going to go ahead and save this, because this would be a much better example of what we're doing. Go ahead and pause your video if you need to copy that in. Again, don't forget I changed the class to highlight inside my HTML document. I'm going to do a save all, refresh my browser window, and that would be a much better example of how I would use a span across a large group of text. Because really, if I'm going to use italic, I'd want that identified with the screen reader, and I'd really want to use the element, the tag element in HTML5 to do that. Remember, we talked about that in the presentation. If there are elements available for those inline designations, you really should use them. Because I mean, that's the purpose of HTML5. Let's try to get things more standardized. Let's follow best practices and do this the right way so that our pages index better and search engine optimization works better. Plus, we actually have more web accessibility with screen readers and the like. Okay, thanks. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. I hope you picked up some interesting facts here on the span element in this tutorial.